Hello everyone. I'm excited to talk with you a little bit about stories. My name's Melinda Zosh and I'm a storyteller. That's my profession. I'm a reporter in Great Falls, Montana, and I love to tell stories. I love to hear stories. Have you ever had someone come up to you and say, "Hey, I've got something to tell you," or better yet, "I've got something to show you"? Now, in the age of technology, it seems that people are using their phones to tell stories now. We used to have video cameras and they were pretty complicated and big, heavy to carry around. Now we've got things like Snapchat, which is actually one of my favorite apps because you can take a picture of yourself and share your emotions with the world. You can take a picture of something that's going on around you, and you can also take videos. And with the age of technology that we're living in, it seems like sharing stories through videos is everything now. People want to see it. They don't just want to hear a story. They want to see what was happening. So I'm really excited tonight to share with you a little bit about Pixar and how this company came to be the renowned, famous, successful company that it is today. So tonight I will be talking about the book Creativity Inc. by Ed Camel and Amy Wallace. And I'm going to be chatting with you a little bit about chapters 3 and 5. Let's move on to our first slide. Well, the making of Pixar. We've all heard of Pixar. We've seen the famous little dancing light that's known to be Pixar and what Pixar is known for. But really, how did this company come to be? How does any company come to be? The great thing about Pixar is that it's based on stories. Not just telling stories, but the story of how this company came to be. So Pixar did not come to be world famous in one night. Rather, it was a company that was 20 plus years in the making. Did you know that originally the goal was to sell Pixar computers, which seemed to be state of the art for the late 1980s, early 1990s? So what did it involve for people to sell these computers? Well, from the beginning, the author of our textbook admits that he didn't have much knowledge about selling this type of hardware. But Steve Jobs was involved with Pixar, and he had a huge vision. He said, "It doesn't matter if you don't have the right knowledge right now. We're going to open Pixar offices, not just in one city, but in cities all over the United States." Now we can move on to our next slide. I've included a picture of Pixar in the early days with what looks like ancient computers, but this was the technology from the 1980s. Of course, we're used to cell phones now and portable laptops, but that wasn't the case in the 1980s. So that's just a nice reminder that people were working on those types of computers. Moving on to the next slide. When a company is starting, what do? Well, they often get advice from people. I worked in the car sales business for a while, in between reporting gigs. So I was a reporter for a bit on television, then I took a break, became a car salesperson. I sold BMWs in upstate New York. Really enjoyed my job. And from the beginning, I got advice. Luckily, those who guided me gave me really good advice. They said, "Look, you need to sell customers on the value of a car. Don't sell them on the dollar amount. Make them fall in love with that vehicle and you'll be successful." Took me a couple tries, but I finally got it down. Now, with Pixar, unfortunately, they took advice from the wrong people. So in the late 1980s, Pixar, again, was just starting up. They're looking for solid advice. How do we get started? How do we be successful? So one group advised to overprice their computers. Pixar said, okay, it's easier to overprice than to underprice and then raise the price back up. So they were pricing their computers at $122,000. That's a lot of money now, or even for the late 1980s. Unfortunately, Pixar only sold 300 units in a span of just a few years. From my experience in car sales, I believe that a buyer must see the value in a product. And sure, advice is important, but we have to be very careful of how we take advice and who we take advice from, especially as Christians. And as we're going to tell our stories to the world, We just need to pick out the information that's good and then sift through the information that maybe isn't so good for us personally and professionally. Moving on to the next slide. So eventually Pixar said, okay, we need to get to that good advice. So they learned from some Japanese people, Japanese business owners, about assembly lines. So after World War II, the Japanese weren't well known here in the States for their products for obvious reasons. But eventually, the Japanese came to be known for having very successful assembly lines. Why were they so successful? Well, they learned assembly lines can be creative and it can be so much fun. They had a belief that every employee should be responsible for fixing problems. It shouldn't be upper level management. Every person should say, you know what, oh, there's something wrong with this piece. Let me speak up about it. And there's no fear to speak up about it. So there was a gentleman named William Deming, and he visited Japan, and he developed an idea in the 1950s about the fact that every person matters. But it wasn't until the late 1980s, think about that, 30 plus years later, where his ideas started to be shared. So Pixar picked up on this idea. They believe that every person is valuable. Every person has insight, and their opinions should be shared. Moving on to the next slide. Well, Steve Jobs had a pivotal role with the formation of Pixar. But he was kind of harsh with those who worked there every day. He said, "You folks don't know how to run a business." And he saw a lot of issues related to money. And as a business person, he was wise. If Pixar wasn't making money, he started to wonder why not? What needs to be done? He had already invested $54 million of his own dollars into Pixar, and he wasn't seeing much return from this investment. Part of the problem was that Pixar wasn't designing new products very quickly. They weren't turning around new products that would create a lot of profit. And of course, with the computer sales that we mentioned, they weren't doing too well with that either, only selling 300 units. So they started to narrow down their focus to computer animation. Moving on to the next slide. So after Pixar got through the rough patch of dealing with the lack of hardware sales, lack of revenue coming in, they started to realize that they could shine at computer animation. They even won some awards working with companies like Trident Gum. But by the early 1990s, they still weren't showing enough profit, and about a third of their employees had to be laid off. By this time, Steve Jobs is probably saying, listen, something needs to change, something here needs to give. He tried to sell Pixar 3 times in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Microsoft even offered him $90 million to buy Pixar. But you know what? He said, that's not enough. I want $120 million. Maybe he realized that Pixar was worth more than that dollar amount or any dollar amount, and that there was hope for the company. Let's talk a little bit now on the next slide about interpersonal relationships and the culture of Pixar. So culture is important in any business. What is culture? Basically, it's the way things are done in a certain organization. So at Pixar, people love to joke, they love to have a good time. Being creative minds, they probably needed to release some stress working on their animations all day. But part of the problem was a clash with Steve Jobs and what he viewed culture as. He's a very serious businessman, and he probably wasn't joking around as much as the guys and gals at Pixar were. But being too serious on the job can lead to more issues. It can lead to things like stress. Joking can be a great way to relieve some of the tension that comes from working so many hours. Moving on to the next slide. So you can see where we've come so far from the beginning of Pixar, not turning many profits, people getting laid off, people losing hope. We're still in the early 1990s at this point. And at this point, Pixar had signed a 3-movie deal. Well, you've probably heard of Toy Story, which ended up becoming a great success. But Disney, at this time, they would provide the financing and they would own and distribute those 3 films. That was part of the agreement with Pixar. So as the folks started working on Toy Story, it seemed to be going pretty well at first. But suddenly it was shut down. And the reason was that the character of Woody, the toy cowboy, he had become mean-spirited, and his character wasn't developing maybe the way that everyone was happy about. So folks there shut down production for a while until the script was rewritten. So the key to telling a good story seems like taking a step back and revising your work and listening to those around you. At least that's the way it seemed to be at Pixar. Moving on to the next slide. Well, the rough patches again were mowed through, so to speak. So got through those. And Steve Jobs says, I'm going to take Pixar public. 1995 comes around, he says, now is the time. Well, he faced some disagreement, but he ended up making the right decision. In 1995, he raised $140 million. So you can imagine he invested 50-some million in Pixar. He ends up raising $140 million. So finally, it takes years, but he's starting to see the success at Pixar. But once this high level of achievement was achieved, some people began wondering, well, what's next? We've worked so hard. Are we going to continue doing this? Where are we going with Pixar? Moving on to the next slide. This is interesting because the author of our book shares some insight into what was going on behind the scenes. So he said, not everyone at Pixar got along really well. So we have people wondering what's next. We have other people disagreeing, but behind the scenes, so they're not openly disagreeing, because they felt like they should keep some issues to themselves. It goes back to culture and where people came from. So certain members of the crew said, we're only here for a short amount of time, we're not going to share all those issues. But that ended up creating some more problems. But stories like this would help them grow. So now, fast forwarding 20 odd years, folks at Pixar can say, hey, you know what? Not everyone got along at one point. We weren't always successful, but now we are, and here's where we've come, here's where we've been. This is starting to sound like the making of a really good story. Moving on to the next slide. Chapter 5 is all about honesty and candor. So with honesty comes a certain level of baggage. Not everyone is going to feel like they can be honest and open and to be themselves and to speak up when they need to speak up. And the author of our book says the word honesty should be replaced with candor. Candor means to be forthright, frank, to speak openly. And he argues that candor will help build those successful relationships. And you know what? A little bit of candor also creates a great story. Moving on to the next slide. So with the idea of candor comes the thought of brain trust. Brain trust is an integral part of Pixar. It was the idea, even a simple concept, that if you bring people together, even in a conference room like this, to talk, to discuss some ideas, they could work through some problems. That could be the solution, is open, honest conversation. So these meetings became the most important part of Pixar. Think about that. It wasn't how many hours someone worked. It wasn't how many animations someone made, how much money they were bringing in, although that was probably important too. It was being honest and holding these brain trust meetings. And they came to learn that if trust does not exist, then creative collaboration will be impossible. How true is that? So what was the result of these brain trust meetings? Well, when they first started, it was probably pretty difficult for people to speak up and to say, you know what, this storyline isn't great, or this character has some flaws that need to be worked out, that need to be believable, or we need to work more on the ending of the story. It's not easy to speak up and say that, especially when you have superiors in the room with you. It could be a little bit intimidating. But I've learned in my own professional career, in the various jobs I've worked, that honesty is everything. You should feel open enough to come to your boss and say, look, this is okay, but let's do this. And I always believe that you should have some positive mixed in with some constructive criticism. So whether you're a leader or a follower, or if you're doing both roles in whatever job you're working, don't you think it's important to speak up and to offer that sort of criticism in an open environment? Well, folks at Pixar believed that was the case. So over time, brain trust grew from a small group of people to a larger group of people. And the walls came down and they said, you know what, we're going to be open, we're going to be honest. And they would give feedback, lots of feedback, but in the end it was up to the director to say, you know what, I'm going to take that and use it and mold it into a better story. Now moving on to the next slide, it's really interesting how a story evolves. So think about this in your own life, whether it be you using Snapchat and you making different stories over the past months or years that you've been using it, how you've seen friends using it, or even how technology has invaded our worlds, so to speak, and how we started with a simple Kodak camera, and now we're taking videos right from our cell phones. So at Pixar, a story evolved from many rewrites. So it didn't start out as being the Toy Story or the Woody that we know today. He started as a mean-spirited character. But it takes patience and candor to create an amazing, memorable story. But candor is only possible if the person on the receiving end is willing to accept that advice. The author said something really important that stuck with me. He said, telling the truth isn't easy, but it's the only way to ensure excellence. Think about that for a moment. It's not easy for me to look across the room and say, look, this can be better. But how is someone going to improve? How is their quality of work going to improve if I'm not open with that person? Constructive criticism is everything. So it could take years before a story comes to fruition. But the point is, was that worth it? Was that time invested wisely in creating a better story? Next slide. Finally, I want to pose a few questions to you. As a storyteller myself, I love to hear people tell a good story. Even better, I love to see a good story. I want to know, what is your idea of a great story? You can give examples from your own personal life, maybe a video you've watched, a TV show, or even a movie. For me, an example of a movie I recently saw was The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio. Some of the scenes were shot here in Montana, others in Calgary to the north of where I live, and some even in Chile. But to me, this movie was great because the cinematography was amazing. There wasn't even much dialogue throughout many aspects of the story, but following someone's tale of survival was incredible. But it wasn't only just the storyline, it was the way the film was shot. But that wasn't something that happened overnight. That takes time, that takes edits, that takes probably some rewrites. So again, what is your idea of a great story? And another question I want to pose to you, you can choose either question, is as a leader, how can you use stories to help others grow? So if you're a manager of a company, or maybe you have a younger sibling or some friends, whatever your role is as a leader in your own life, how can you use stories to help others grow? So in Pixar's case, they can tell newcomers, this is our story. We came from nothing. We didn't know anything about hardware sales. We were losing money. We were all on the verge of quitting, but we stuck with it. Here's our story. So I want to know how you use stories in your own personal life. Well, I appreciate you listening tonight to this presentation, and I'm looking forward to interacting with you more throughout our 8-week course.